So we're looking into the historical text of Megilat Esther, of the book of Esther, and we learn that it actually starts with our foremother Sarah, but textually we're going to start with Rachel. And in Genesis chapter 30, verse 14, it says, Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest, and he found dudaim in the field, and brought them to Leah his mother. And Rachel said to Leah, Now give me some of your son's dudaim. And she said to her, Is it a small matter that you have taken my husband, that you wish also to take my son's dudaim? So Rachel said, Therefore he shall sleep with you. Rachel says to Leah that Jacob will sleep with Leah tonight as payment for your son's dudaim. When Jacob came from the field in the evening, and Leah came forth toward him, and she said, You shall come to me, because I have hired you with my son's dudaim, and he slept with her on that night. So what happened here? What happened here, let's not identify what dudaim is. Dudaim, let's say, are a type of flower. It's debatable what the interpretation of dudaim is, but let's just say that Reuben, who was the child of Leah, brought his mother dudaim, a certain type of flower or plant. Rachel was jealous. She had no children. She wanted the dudaim. And she said, even though Jacob was supposed to sleep with me tonight, his bed is in my tent. If you give me the dudaim, I will let Reuven, the eldest son, take the bed from my tent and put it into your tent, Leah, and you can sleep with him tonight. Well, Jacob was a righteous person. Who was it up to Rachel? And Rachel was the beloved wife of Jacob. Jacob had Rachel, Leah. He had concubines Bilhah and Zilpah. And so how could it be that she would trade flowers instead of sleeping with her husband, her beloved husband? That's part of our mystery. We now go. Now Rashi tells us the Rashi from Rabbah 72 verse 3 says, Tonight's cohabitation belonged to me, Rachel, but I will give it to you in lieu of your son's dudaim, since she treated the cohabitation of the righteous man lightly. She did not merit to be buried with him. So who is buried in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, in the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, to this day? There are several people that we won't mention, but of the people who are there are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, and Leah. And Rachel is not buried there. Because she sold out the opportunity to sleep with her righteous husband, she had to be buried in a desolate place. And if you go to Rachel's cemetery to this very day, it's like a fortress because it's out of the way. It's surrounded by Arabs. They had to build a fortress with high walls so that people aren't shot at when they go to visit her kever, her grave. And to this very day, she is buried on the way to Ephrat in a desolate place, and we're gonna find out why at a later time today. We next go. So that was Rachel mishap number 1. Jacob decides that he's going to leave Lavan. It's time for him to part ways with his father-in-law, and he takes all of what was promised to him, and he sneaks away from Lavan, and they leave. Rachel, wanting to do something positive for her father, decides to steal his idol. And then, so it says here in Genesis 31, verse 19, Vatignov Rachel et hatrafim asher la'aviha. And Rachel stole the trafim, the idols that belonged to her father. So Laban realizes they escaped. He runs after them, and Laban says to Jacob, "Lama ganafta et Elokai? Why did you steal my gods?" And that's in Genesis 31, verse 30. If you turn to 32, Jacob says, "You didn't steal your idol." He had no idea that Rachel had stolen his idol. So Laban then goes around and searches everyone to see where his idol is. And Rachel says, "Well, it's my time of the cycle. You shouldn't be here." And he was put off. She was sitting actually on top of the idol to protect its location. Laban leaves, and this is what Jacob says to Laban. Genesis 31, verse 32. Im asher timtza et Elokecha, lo yichyeh neged achenu. The one with whom you find your gods shall not live. Well, when a tzaddik, when a righteous person makes a promise, God really observes that. Not that he has to observe it immediately, but he's going to observe what a righteous person promises. So now we know two things. One is because she exchanged the dudaim for her night with Jacob, she doesn't merit to be buried with the other foremothers and forefathers. And because she stole the idols, she's going to die young. We turn the page and we go to Genesis 35, verse 17. Rachel is in the middle of labor, and it's a hard labor. And the midwife says to her, "Don't worry, this is also a son." And she's about to die. And Rachel calls this son Ben-Oni, the son of my affliction. And her husband calls him Binyamin. So this is her second son. She's age 36. She dies on giving birth to her son Binyamin at that time. So now she's died early, and she's buried on the side of the road on the way to Ephrat. Where do we go next? We go to the prophets. No, we go to the kings. We're going to the kings. They go to Samuel, chapter 1, verse 15. Background. God says to King Saul, the Amalekim, the Amalekites, the Amalekim, they have to be destroyed. Women, children, men, all of their possessions, all of their animals, do not leave them anyone alive. Do not have mercy on them. Do not take any of their belongings. They are to be wiped out. Why are they going to be wiped out? What did Amalek do that they deserve to be wiped out? We read about it 2 weeks ago when the Amalek went after the Jews when they had just come out as slaves, when they were vulnerable, when they were weak, and they decided even after all the miracles that God had shown in the splitting of the sea and the 10 plagues, that they were going to go after the Jews. And they were tired and they were not a threat to anyone. So the nature of the Amalek is to be vicious. And there are still some alive. And we think that Hamas is like Amalek. They're vicious. They prey on the weak, prey on people who aren't civilians. They have the nature of Amalek. And Amalek isn't only Amalek. Amalek are those who are like Amalek. But they are, at this point, they are Amalek. We don't know who are Amalek. We only know that those who act like Amalek could be Amalek. And they have to be destroyed because there's not even a scintilla of Rahmanis, of mercy to Amalek. They have to be destroyed. King Saul thought he knew better. And he had misplaced mercy on Agag, who was the king of Amalek. And it says here in Samuel, first chapter, verse 15, Vayachmol Sha'ol v'ha'am al Agag, v'al meitav hatzon v'habakar, v'hamishnim v'al hakarim v'al kol hatov, v'lo avu hacharimam, v'chol, and it goes on. So it says here that, then this is what happened. King Shaul had misplaced mercy on Agag, and he let him stay alive for one night. And in that one night, he impregnated a woman. And from that one woman came Cyrus. What Cyrus was there? Remember the name Agag. What Cyrus was there? As soon as Saul was anointed king of Israel, he was commanded to wage war against Amalek. He was no simple farmer's son, the new king. He was head and shoulders above the rest of his people, spiritually as well as physically. In his entire lifetime, he committed but one sin. That's in the Gemara 22b. Still, Saul was chosen over him as Israel's finest son. In his great test, he was given the assignment of completing the task begun by Moshe and Yehoshua, by Moses and Joshua, 430 years earlier, to eradicate Amalek completely, even its livestock. Saul said to himself, if it is a calamity when even a single wayfarer dies, how tragic it would be to slaughter an entire nation. If the people have sinned, how have the livestock sinned? If the adults have sinned, how have the children sinned? Logical questions. We might well ask them today. A heavenly voice said to him, Al tahid tzaddik harbe. Do not be too righteous. Saul, righteous Saul, fell into the trap that was to cost him his throne. He substituted his own concept of mercy for God's. He thought he would be more merciful than the merciful God. And so in that one night that he let Agag stay alive, Agag impregnated a woman. And we go now to the Megillah. The second chapter, the fifth verse, it says, Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira u'shemo Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimi ben Kish Ish Yemini. That Mordechai was the son of Binyamin. That's an important fact. What else does it say? It says that at the beginning it talks about Haman, Ish Agagi. Where did Haman, who threatened the Jews, come from? Agag. So in that one night that Saul had misplaced mercy, Haman came down, descended from him. So we see when you don't listen to God, if you think that you're greater than God and you have misplaced mercy, from him came Haman. So where do we go from here? We go to Esther. What if I were to say to you, the Khomeini from Iran took Netanyahu's daughter against her will to become a queen? There would be an outcry. There would be Tehillim. There would be people gathering. How could it be that he would, a drunk king or an evil king would take a daughter of Israel as his wife? But that's what happened. Mordechai was one of the great sages of the Knesset Hagadolah, of the ruling Jewish body at the time in Persia and in exile. And his wife, Esther, or let's say his adopted daughter, or both, was taken by the king to be his wife. That would seem to anybody to be a tragedy to Judaism and to an affront to all Jews. She's in the palace, and we're thinking, Nebuch, the poor thing. What could Hashem be thinking? What could God be thinking? It wasn't enough that she was an orphan, that she lost her parents, that you had to take her away from her uncle or her husband. Well, we know what happened. Haman decided to pass a decree that all the Jews should be eradicated in one day throughout 127 provinces that were ruled by King Ahasuerus. When Mordecai hears this, he sends a messenger to Esther and says, Esther, you got to go to the king right now. You've got to tell him what's going on. You've got to save the Jews. But there was a rule. A queen cannot go to the king unless she is summoned by the king. So she says to Mordecai, I can't go to the king. I haven't been summoned to the king for at least 30 days. If I go there, he's going to kill me. Mordecai says in the 4th chapter, verse 14, Kim hacharesh tacharishi ba'es hazot, revach b'hatzala ya'amod leYehudim mimakom acher, va'at uveit avich tovedu. So Mordecai says to her, for if you persist in keeping silent, Mordecai says to Esther, at a time like this, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from some other place, while you and your father's house will perish. What does that mean? It means that Mordecai was sure that the Jews would be saved. And if Esther wasn't going to move to go to the king and ask the king to save the Jews, somehow it will be that the Jews will be saved, but you, Uveit Avich, and your father's home will perish. Why will they perish? Because if Esther isn't involved in saving the Jews, whoever will come to eradicate Achash, the king, and overturn his decree will eradicate her as well, because she is the queen. Also, because this was an opportunity for Esther to turn around what her ancestor, King Saul, did. King Saul was from Rachel, from a descendant of Rachel. And the fact that he caused Agag to be alive, we had to do a tikkun. There had to be a repair by a descendant of Rachel to overturn what her ancestor Saul did by keeping Agag alive. And this was her opportunity to overturn what her ancestor had done that was wrong and incorrect and hurt the Jews. And she was the one who had the opportunity at this point to repair what her ancestor had done all those years ago, to come good on this. And he goes on, Mordecai goes on, and this is beautiful. This is the crux of the book, because how horrible that we feel that a daughter of Israel is taken by a drunkard Persian king. This is the key. Umi yodea im le'et kazot higat lamachot. And who knows, but it was for this very moment that God had you become queen, to be able to save the Jews. Now, this opportunity is huge, but where do we see Rachel's intervention in all of this plan? Remember, could we feel that Rachel was punished by not being buried with the patriarchs? Yes. Could we feel that she was punished because she took her father's idol and Jacob said that she would die? We could feel that she was punished. The crux of all of this is, even when we feel that God is punishing us, it's also for the good. Why? We go back to Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. Jeremiah is out in the fields. Kol b'rama nishma. There's a voice on the horizon. Nehi b'chi tamurim. Bitter voices are heard. Rachel mevaka al banea. Rachel is crying for her children. Ve'ana lehinachem. She refuses to be comforted. Al baneha ki enenu. For her children, because they are gone. What is the context? The context is that even though she wasn't buried with the foremothers and forefathers, she was buried on this desolate road because God knew when the Jews were going to go out to exile after the destruction of the first temple, they were going to pass her grave. And as they passed her grave, she sees them up in heaven and she starts to cry. God placed her on this desolate road so she could see her children go out to exile and pray for them. And how do we know that souls survive death? Because it's right here. Rachel's soul is crying out to God. She sees her children going into exile and she refuses to be comforted. Ko amar Hashem. So says God. Mini kolech mi bechi. Stop your cry, your voice from crying. Ve'enayich midima. And your eyes from crying. Ki yesachar le'fu'ulatech ne'um Hashem. V'shavu me'eretz oyev. Because there is a reward for all your efforts, says God, and your children will return from the land of their enemies. So says Rashi. What was her reward? What did she do? Rashi says that God was angry at the Jews because King Manasseh put an idol into the holy temple, and God became angry. The forefathers and foremothers went to comfort God, to try to assuage him, to mollify him, and to come back from his anger against the Jews for putting the idol in the holy temple. But God refused to be comforted. I'm going to say it in Hebrew, and then I'm going to say it in English. באו האמות ואימהות לפייס את הקדוש ברוך הוא, על שהעמיד מנשה דמות בהיכל ולא נתפייס. All the forefathers and foremothers came to God to appease him because King Manasseh had put an idol in the holy temple, and God refused to be appeased. Ba'a Rachel va'amra. In comes Rachel and says, Ribono shalolam, rachamei merubim, Master of the universe, whose mercy is greater, rachamecha, your mercy, or rachamei basavradam, or the mercy of human beings. Halo ani hichnasti tzarati leveiti kekol ha'avodah she'avad Yaakov et avi lo avad ela bishvili. I brought sorrows, I brought trouble into my own home because for the 7 years that Jacob worked for my father, he worked to get my hand in marriage. When it came time for the wedding, they put my sister Leah in instead of me. It wasn't enough that I stayed quiet. That sign that was created between Jacob and Rachel because Jacob felt that Lavan, who was a trickster, would try to put Leah in instead of Rachel. They made up a personal sign, and Rachel gave that sign over to Leah. Afata, so too with you. If your children brought sorrows, brought anguish to your home, the holy temple, by putting the idol in it, shtok lahem, stay quiet. Anah HaKadosh Baruch Hu va'amar, God replied, Rachel yafel amadit sanigaria. Rachel, you learned your defense tactics well. There is a reward for your effort in trying to appease me. You succeeded in appeasing me. And Jews will return to Eretz Israel in her merit. So we see it goes back from the time of Rachel in Genesis, when she did something not smart by exchanging dudaim for her husband's place in the tent. And yet, even when she was punished by being buried in a godforsaken place, it is to the benefit and merit of Rachel and her children that she was able to see them go into exile. And God promised that she would see the Jews return. So going back to Esther, who was a descendant of Rachel, who had to overturn her ancestor King Saul, and was allegedly punished. Yet, what happens? She goes to the king, and let's see what happens when she goes to the king. See, there's a lot hidden in this book that we don't know about. There is a midrash. Here she is afraid. She's going to the king of Persia, the mighty king of Persia, and she was not bidden to go there. But yet, she had to save the Jews. So, what does Esther do? Esther is walking in the halls of the palace towards the king's room, and she prays. And I want you to understand the benefit of prayer. It can change everything around. It can just change everything around. I'm going to say it in Hebrew, and then I'm going to interpret it in English. Vatitpalel vatomer, Hashem Elokei Yisrael, Asher marshalta mimei kedem, ubarata et haolam azorna, amatcha asher nish'arti yitoma, bli av ve'em, v'mishulal aniyah sho'elet mibayit lebayit, ken anochi sho'elet rachamecha, mechalon lechalon, beveit achashverosh, va'ata Hashem hatzlichana, la'amascha ha'aniyah hazot, v'hatzila et son maretcha, min ha'ayvim ha'elu, asher kamu aleinu, ke'en lecha matzor hoshia, berav uvima'at. Va'ata avi yitomim v'amod na li min hayitoma hazot, asher b'chastecha batcha. Uv'tana oti l'rachamim lifnei ha'ish hazeh, ki yiretiv, v'hashpilehu lefanai, ki ata mashpilgeim. What does Rachel say? What does Esther say? God, Lord of Israel, she prayed, who has ruled since the beginning of days and who created the world. Help your maidservant who is orphaned of her father and mother and who is like a poor person who goes begging from door to door. Likewise do I seek your mercy as I go from window to window in the house of Achashverosh. And now, God, grant success to your impoverished maidservant and save the flock which you tend from the evil who rise up against us. There is nothing to restrain you from saving us, the many and the few. Father of orphans, stand by this orphan who has placed her trust in your compassion and kindness. Grant me mercy before this man, for I fear him. Cast him down before me, for you cast down the haughty. So Esther turns to God in her fear as she's walking towards her enemy, her greatest fear. And she turns to God and says, I know you can save me. Let him have mercy. Let him see me and hear my prayers. Well, what has Esther given up by going to the king? We learn in the Gemara what she has given up to go to the king. Because in that interaction with Mordecai, where Mordecai says to her, who knows, it was for this exact moment that you became queen. She gives in to Mordecai. And she says to him, gather the people and tell them not to eat or drink. Tell them to pray. And as they're praying and as they're fasting, I will go to the king, even though it isn't the normal way to go to the king because I was not asked to come. And she answers with 3 words. And we sing, when the man who reads the Megillah on Purim reads it, he reads these 3 words in the same voice of sadness and anguish as the tune in which we say Lamentations, Echa, on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th day of Av. And he sings it like this. Becha asher avadati. And there's a pause. And we can feel the sadness. Because she's saying, as I have lost, I will lose. What does the Gemara say about what she has lost? The Gemara tells us, teaches us, I'm not going to read it inside, I'm going to summarize it. Esther was taken against her will to the king. So when she had relations with him, It was against her will. Technically, once he died, she would have been able to resume being the wife of Mordecai. But once she voluntarily goes to the king, as Mordecai is now asking her to do, she will never be able to return to Mordecai. She will have Kasharavadati. When did she lose the first time? She lost her parents. She is an orphan, but she was willing to risk her life and risk her ability to resume her marriage to Mordecai, her only relative, to go to the king to save the Jews. V'ka'asher avadati. Look at this heroism. Look what she was willing to do to save the Jews. And so we now understand. Now, there is a midrash that says that Sarah lived 127 years. Esther was the queen over 127 provinces. We understand that it was in the merit of Sarah's 127 years that her descendant Esther, millennia down, thousands of years later, would be able to become the queen to save the Jews. There is a Gemara that talks about this connection. At the time of Rabbi Akiva, his students were having a day that they were distracted from their learning. And Rabbi Akiva says, this whole medrash, there is a connection between 127 years that Sarah lived and 127 provinces over which Rachel ruled. What is the connection? Why did he mention this midrash at the time that his students were distracted? And the answer is this. Sarah, most of her life, never had a child. And by the time she hit 50, 60, 70, she thought it was over. So she might have said to herself, why am I doing all of these good deeds? Why am I amassing all of this wealth if I have no one who can inherit these good deeds? No one who inherit the material and spiritual benefit of my efforts. But she went on anyway because she understood there is a bank up in heaven. And even if it's not an immediate benefit, that she can bank those credits for the future, for the community at large. It ended up that she did have a son, but yet, in the merit of her feeling that she was going to bank it for the future, she was able to bank it to the future. Why were the students of Rabbi Akiva distracted? Because many of them, some say all of them, had a prophecy that the destruction of the temple was imminent. And they were thinking to themselves, why am I learning Torah if the temple is going to be destroyed in Judaism? The future of Judaism is questionable. And Rabbi Akiva is saying to them, it may be that in the immediate future, you will go out into exile. Your children may not survive, but your learning Torah will be banked up in heaven for the community. And the end of the story is that even though he was a Persian drunkard, Esther had relations with Ahasuerus. From him came Darius II, the son of Ahasuerus, and Esther, who permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Boom. It starts with Sarah. It goes through the books of Genesis and Samuel and Jeremiah and the Megilat and all the other books. There is a trajectory. There is a 1,000-year plan. And it teaches us that every part along the way, it would have been sad if Rachel wasn't buried with the patriarchs. It would have been sad that Saul didn't listen and kept Agag alive. It would have been sad, and if you lived in any one of those periods, you might have said, God, what are you thinking? And only because we trust in God do we trust that what may look bad now in our lifetimes, there is a reason in the future. And we are not privy because we are not God. And we cannot say to God, can you look, God, when you make plans, can you have us in mind? Can you consult with us? We'd like to have a say in the matter. No. The only say we have in the matter is that we trust that whatever God does, he does for the best of each person and the Jewish community. So this trajectory of many books and thousands of years is a lesson to us in belief in God and trust in God, because he was right when he told Rachel, Vishavu banam levulam, your children will return to their land. And it's in the merit of women, Sarah and Rachel and Esther. And we all know that it was in the merit of the women in Egypt that we were redeemed. And we also know that it is in the merit of women that we will be redeemed. And it is our ability to have rachmanis, to have mercy, because we have a womb, which in Hebrew is called rechem, which is the source of our rachmanis, our empathy, our sympathy, our kindness. And because at the time of the destruction, all the gates of God, towards God, between man and God, were closed, except one, the gate of tears. And that was still open when you have sincere prayer. And women are ones who tend to be more of the tearers, the ones who feel rachmanis, the loss of a child. So Rachel, it wasn't Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob who were able to appease God. It was Rachel, the one who was punished by being on the side of the road and dying early, who was able to appease God. And we, with our wombs, with our love, with our devotion, it is we who are going to bring the ultimate redemption. May it be speedily in our time.
Amen. Wow.
Thank you.
So
I
good.
think I have something to say. She wants to talk.